spiritual path makes your heart more tender. Actually, that's quite exactly what we're going to talk about today, because we're going to talk about community, and we're going to talk about why we need it, and what happens when we don't have it, and what happens when we do have it. Shanti mentioned I had the great good fortune to get started on this spiritual path when I was 22 and never looked back. I was part of that generation that was really looking for an alternative, and when I saw it, I was just so glad to take it. And so I have actually been part of founding two different communities. One is the Grass Valley community, Nevada City, which is the original Ananda village, which is still going strong. In fact, next summer is our 50th anniversary, which just sounds like really unbelievable. And this here in Palo Alto, we've been here since 1987. Ananda Palo Alto's been here since 81. I've been here since 87. So all those sound like kind of big numbers at a certain point. The main difference is we were young when we started. Now we are chronologically developed. Some of you are chronologically underdeveloped, but if you just stick with it, it'll happen to you too. Community is a very popular word these days. I hear people talk about it. Sometimes it has to do with ethnicities and religions and economic groups and people who all like to do quilting, and you know, if you're making little toys for children, you're part of the Toys for Children community. And it's interesting how people use words to describe, you know, words go in and out of fashion. And when we started communities, it was the back to the land time, it was the repudiation of materialism. There were kind of like two threads. There was the mostly drug-oriented. When you used to cross the Canadian border when they wanted to search your car for drugs, this is in the 60s, because we all look the same. No, I don't take drugs, I meditate. Really. And then they would let you go through. They wouldn't search your car. I mean, there was the people who went one way, but everybody was trying to change their consciousness. You know, now even marijuana and all of that has a whole different gestalt than it had when we were younger, when I was in that age and that era. But what we had figured out at that point was if you changed yourself from the inside out, everything else would follow. And then we got real interested in how we could change it on the outside too, but the entire issue was consciousness. And I mean, I vividly remember when it just came to me that it was all emanating from inside of me, and if I could get a grip on what was going on inside, then everything else would come after that. But the great difficulty of getting a grip on what's going inside is that it's inside, and that's the good news and that's the nightmare, like simultaneously. Because we are so extraordinarily influenced by everything that's going on around us that we don't even know that we're being influenced. An hour ago, 2 hours ago, Jyotish and Devi stood here and they talked about Autobiography of a Yogi, and they talked about different words that are hidden in that book that you only discover the third or fourth time you read it, or the fifth or the sixth or the 25th time. But one of the sentences in there are that thoughts are universal, they're not individual. And it's just like, well, yeah, but we don't really understand what that means until we begin to try to differentiate ourselves from whatever's going on around us. And we begin to realize just the degree to which we just are a reflection of what's going on around us, an unthinking reflection. I was just a little too young to be a beatnik, but beatniks were the first thing that started when the whole culture started breaking apart, when I was just coming of age. But I remember being a female person like 15 and 16 years old and being a little, more than a little insecure about how to present myself as a grown woman and all of that. And I remember how annoyed I was that the way I was supposed to look was dictated by the world around me. You know, that you couldn't even buy clothes. I didn't know about consignment stores and thrift stores. I learned about that later. You couldn't even buy something that would distinguish you. And the worst of it was, and even to this day it still annoys me, when the fashion starts, you know it's ugly. And I'm taking to the women in the room. When it first starts, you know it's ugly. And then gradually you begin to think it's attractive. Is that not true? There was the era of the big black shoes, and I remember I actually walked into a shoe store. First I knew they were ugly, then I picked one up and I actually said, these are nice. Whoa, and I put them down like that. They weren't nice, they were awful. But thoughts are universal. And just even if you travel at all, which I know in this day and age, many of you were not born in this country or just have been in lots of different places or live in different countries, you realize how arbitrary it is. So much of what we think of as just the way things are is not really the way things are. They're just the way they always have been in the world that I've been in, the way my parents told me. I grew up in a Jewish family, and I thought I was from one of those intensely intellectual Jewish families. My brother was twice the state debate champion in the state of Texas. I thought debate was conversation. I really did. You know, I present my point of view, then I wait, you present yours, then I answer you with my arguments, and then this one comes in with his. I was 50. All the people who knew me before I was 50 can verify this. I was 50 before I found out debate wasn't conversation. You know, it's like it's a conversation stopper is what it is, you know? Why aren't you responding? You know, why aren't you putting in your point of view? I'll just, you know, it's all so many different things. So when we begin to understand that maybe I want to self-define, or I've picked out of all these different choices this other thread. When Jyotish and Devi were talking about the effect of Paramahansa Yogananda's autobiography of a yogi and of his consciousness and the energy he put out, I mean, let's think an historical example that's a little bit longer. Jesus was crucified. You know, it was about as unglorious an ending as you can imagine. All the powers that be crushed him. And all the people who followed him were terrified. And almost all of them were also killed. If you were living at the time, you would have thought, well, that was nothing. You know, and all the people holding the spears and the money and the buildings. I went to Jerusalem for the first time a little more than a year ago or 2 years ago. And most of the Jerusalem temple is not there anymore. But the part that's left, it's really big. I mean, it's big rocks and it's big paving stones and it's a big wall, and you would naturally think it was important because it was so big. But nobody remembers anything that happened there except what happened to Jesus there. Because there's a different power that's acting, and that's the power of thought, the power of truth. And it's way outside of time. After I speak, 15 minutes after I speak, my wonderful friend Purushottama Joseph Selby is going to speak about the physics of God. Shanti spoke this morning about the brain and how all of this works. You know, Einstein a long time ago told us things that were really important, which is it's not what it seems. And there's a certain point where that occurs to you. I've been part of Ananda now since many decades. Different periods of my life I had to do marketing, and so like this, so you want to get the demographic profile of who your people are and so on like that. Impossible. We've been trying for decades to figure out who our people are. Because our people are people, these are our people. It has occurred to you that somehow or another something else is going on, and it has to do, it starts here. It starts here, that somehow if I can adjust my inner reality, then everything else I'm trying to make happen will happen. But once that idea gets in our minds, I mean, this area where I've lived for more than 30 years now is a marvelous place to be for a whole lot of really good reasons. People understand money as energy. They understand that creativity is wealth. They realize that if it wasn't there yesterday, I can make it be there tomorrow. I mean, these are really dynamic spiritual principles. Even though they may express in the material world, the power of them comes from the spirit. So it's a marvelously out-of-the-box place to live. But on the other hand, I recently went to the Stanford Shopping Center, which I used to go to much more often. As a Nayaswami, I always wear blue so I don't get to shop anymore. I used to love to go to the Stanford Shopping Center, but wow, talk about the best of the material plane. Too expensive for the average person to buy, but whoa, to look at it. Just like, let's do the material plane just right and see if this time it'll really make us happy. You know, that's what this area is to us. It's cultured, it's refined, it's intelligent, it's dynamic, and this time it's going to work. You know, this lifetime I'm going to be totally satisfied without ever really having to change myself. But then something happens. From the autobiography, it's called the anguishing monotony. 2 words, anguishing monotony. Even tragedy is interesting. It's the anguishing monotony that really gets to us. One more day, just like the other days. And the soul just screams for something else. But then you become this very odd little ray, just moving through this world. I sometimes think that the people who are really conscious of the potential are like one pat of butter spread over the whole world. I mean, if you really look at the population of the world, that's how thin it is. But what fixes that is the power of thought, the vibration of consciousness, which is, why do we remember Jesus? How do we even know that he was there? And quite apart from being able to read the Bible or the Quran or the Bhagavad Gita, I mean, I'm just can be universal about any of them, is because behind that is this pulsing rhythm of truth. And we don't learn it, we recognize it. I am a mediocre singer at best, but I am good enough to stand in the alto section if the 2 people who can really sing it well are on either side of me, right? Because I can recognize the right note. And I can tell when I'm singing it, and I can tell when I'm hearing it. You know? And that actually makes me a much better singer than I thought I was, because I didn't realize that even that is a certain accomplishment. But what we're doing spiritually is all around us is this swirling, whether you call it sound or light or vibrations or, you know, a Purushottama can probably give it lots of words that I can never remember. You know, I can hear him and I understand him in the moment and then I lose it. But I get that it's happening all the time and all we have to do is tune into it. But what happens is, when I'm standing between those 2 great alto singers, I am so solid. And then when I'm back in my kitchen, something happens, you know, and I can get that it's close, but it's not quite the same. And I'm just belting it out, but I'm drifting. And so what happens to us in this world, because thoughts are universal, not individual, that if we take our little note, even though we've heard it perfectly clearly, and we get too far away from where it's pulsing, the worst thing that happens is we don't know we've strayed. If you know you've strayed, you're really fine, because then you're going to keep trying to go back. But it's much more insidious than that. It's that you begin to think that you're still on note, and only if you're fortunate enough to come back into the choir, whatever that really looks like, do you realize, I was farther away than I thought. So Yogananda comes to America. Yogananda comes to America in 1920, which is just really like nowadays. Well, I went to visit my friend in Delhi, and now Starbucks is in Delhi. And in fact, she's an American woman, but she'd made friends with the people in Starbucks. So I love this. She's an American Nayaswami from Ananda. She happens to be a black woman, so she's dark-skinned. She looks more Indian than she actually looks American, or she can look in India. So that people who open Starbucks ask her to do the Vedic ceremony to open the Starbucks, right? And it's like, welcome, welcome to the new world. So then she takes me over there. I'm not quite sure whether they give her free coffee all the time, or we might have just gone to be friends. But I walk in, it's full of, no surprise, Indian people who are all sitting at their computers, mostly Apples, drinking coffee. I said, am I in New Delhi? I think I'm at the Starbucks across the street from our Ananda church on El Camino. All these Indian people with their, their computers open. It's like it's all the same thing. We're all like looking for this. Now, how I ever got there, let me think where I was trying to go with that. But oh, I know what it is. Yogananda came in 1920. That's where I was. Now the world we live in, everybody's everywhere. That's what I was trying to say. We're just so wonderfully mixed up. And you have to find a discreet way to say it. What was your first language, you ask someone, Where is your native home? Where do your parents live? Just because it could be anything these days. 1920, nobody had ever seen anyone like him at all. Dressed in orange with this long hair, and his first disciple in Massachusetts, Dr. Lewis, a small town in Massachusetts in 1920, this dark-haired man with this long hair, all dressed in orange, comes striding across their little square, and Dr. Lewis was interested first. His wife was going to have nothing to do with this, this crazy heathen. That's the world he walked into. Nobody had ever heard of what he was teaching, and he just started this flow of energy. And Jyotish this morning said something that, earlier this afternoon, just said something that was so interesting to me. Yogananda crisscrossed the country, gave lectures at all these halls, stayed a month in every place, gave many classes. He was putting the thought into the ether. He said, the masters say, wherever a master has ever been, his vibration remains there forever. Out of time, out of space, a wholly different dimension of reality, this power is planted. This is the point of pilgrimage. This is holy places. You go to Ananda village now, it's been there 50 years. You just walk on that land and you don't quite know where you are, but you know you are somewhere else. Because for 50 years, people have been living according to these teachings. And you begin, the note just rings in your ear. And what happens to you when you hear it, it's like, oh my gosh, this is my song. My soul always had a melody. That's, Shanti refers to when Swami Kriyananda walked into the room. American man, direct disciple of an Indian master. 1969, he was in his early 40s. He just strode into this room like this, and his consciousness just came over me like this. And just exactly what Shanti said, I looked at him and I said, I knew about the principle. The principle of self-realization was there, but I didn't know what to do with it. And I'd never seen it. And I'm looking at it. That's what it looks like. It was like this singing bowl, except it was more like a giant Chinese gong, wang, like that. And it was like, there it is. But then what happens is you move away from it. And Americans especially, I've traveled a little bit, not as much as Jyotish and Devi, but enough. Americans have a lot of heart. And we're interested, we're creative, especially in this area. I love all audiences in this area. They're so wide awake and everybody's listening. But Americans like to be shrewd. It's really important that nobody take advantage of us. So what happens is people feel it, they hear it, they know it, they recognize it, but then you go away. And you turn on the news, and your mother asks, what did you do today? This and this. And all of a sudden, all of these other notes start singing, and you don't know it's there. So when Yogananda came in 1920, he had a very simple thing. Those of you who are interested in doing this, you need to band together. Isn't that obvious? You need to make a choir. You need to make a soul choir of people who hear the right melody and will sing it to each other. And not for the sake of, tribal thinking and so on. I was involved over many years, twice, big, I guess political is the right word. When we were founding the Ananda community, twice we had to go into these big battles with our neighbors in this little tiny county thing, you know. Once we had, anyway, I don't even want to go into it, but they're great stories. They're in my book out there. But I had to stand against opposition in a political environment. We tried to incorporate once as a California city, which was really a lark. Anyway, but people would say, you know, you have a strong leader, you're brainwashed, you're all the same. And for a while, I would, you know, just like get real, I tried to be real rational in response. Finally, I just began to laugh. I said, you have never met a more stubborn, strong-minded, pig-headed group of people. Because what happens when you start living according to to the right melody is that suddenly you really become yourself. And it's the strangest paradox. The more you become yourself, the more you become universal, the more you become yourself. But community, which is what Yogananda strongly recommended, simple living, high thinking, those of you with high ideals, you know, pool your resources, buy land in the country, grow your own food, live a simple life. You'll be far less wealthy, but you'll be so much happier. You know, and he said it would be the lifestyle of the future. You know, I've struggled to help found 2 of these communities. The second one was easier than the first. Well, I don't know. Second one was different than the first. But it's this thought form that says, those of us who do share these high ideals, you know, we live in the Chinese curse. We live in the interesting times. That's the Chinese curse. May you live in interesting times. We live in interesting times. But what these interesting times are doing, it's very simple. The middle ground is being erased. You know, mostly society is shaped like a big cigar. You know, just there's a few people who are good, a few people who are not good, and everybody else just kind of lumps around in the middle. But what's happening now, it's turning into a dumbbell. It's getting really skinny in the middle, and you have to go on one side or the other. And it's not just, I'm not talking politics. I'm talking God, greater reality, atheism, materialism. You know, every problem we have comes down to the fact that people have somehow decided that we are not part of a greater reality. It's just me. And if I want it, and I can figure out a way to get it, I think I'll take it. Why wouldn't I? There was I may be misrepresenting this, but this is how I remember it. Probably a number of years ago in one of the high schools there, you know, a little south of here, one of the big Silicon Valley high schools, huge cheating scandal. Because the kids figured out, because they're very, very smart, that, you know, everything's on computer. So they went in the computer and they just made all their grades better, right? Okay, that was not such a good thing, right? Except what happened afterwards was even more shocking to people. The students said, nobody ever asked me if I was learning anything. Nobody asked me about my character. Certainly no one ever asked me if I was happy. All they wanted to know was what my grades were. So I found a more efficient way to get them, right? If they'd been in industry, they would have gotten a bonus for doing it. Because that's where we're going. If I can get it for myself, why wouldn't I get it? And if I'm not connected to anything else, who cares what happens? It's a nightmare. And this is the dumbbell that's happening. And it's not about health care, and it's not about tariffs. It's not about any of the other things that I get only through the universal thought form because I don't really pay attention to it. It's about whether or not we are part of a greater reality, and whether or not who you are in your character defines not only who you are, but whether or not you're happy. When I was a child, that was my answer. I wanted to be happy. I couldn't figure out why nobody was talking to me about how to be happy. They were only talking about how to be successful. And I had this, because of reincarnation, been there, done that. Anguishing monotony about, yeah, I could, but at the end of it, I know where I'm going to be standing, which is nowhere unless it's here. That's why I jumped on the bandwagon when I saw Swami Kriyananda. Somebody is finally telling me the truth. And the fact that he was starting a community where not only I could live, but I could serve others. And there it is. You want the right life for yourself, and part of the right life for yourself is if you don't give it away, do you think you're going to have more? Do you think if you hoard it, you're going to have more? Do you think if you close the doors and just try to hold on to it? I mean, this world is a joke. Our friends, very good friends, live on the big island of Hawaii, you know, where the goddess, the volcano goddess, is just erupting all over. We've all been watching these video things as she sends this lava stream down. You know, here's our friend's house, you know, it's like this, and it's going like this, and our Ananda community burned down in 1976, which is now a long time ago. Jyotish and I, you know, you don't think it's going to happen to you. 7 years of drought, hot June afternoon. He and I are standing on the hill, for those of you who've been there, Rajasi, up on Rajasi Ridge, Sunset Meadow. We're looking down. 7 years of drought, everything is absolutely bone dry. The wind is behind it. It's downhill from Ananda. It's just racing up the hill. I said to Jyotish, it looks like it's going to burn us down. And he says, uh-huh. You know, and like a few hours later, 450 acres, absolute ash. People's houses, nothing. Just gone. And it's like, but we're so sincere. You know? Because at the end, all you have is your character. Who you've been, how you've responded. But it's not easy in these days to hold it. It's really simple. We need each other. And we need each other on a very high and subtle level. We don't need each other to say, oh, you're such a nice person, it's just fine. I had a career as a corporate trainer that lasted about a nanosecond. I did about 3 programs. This was 1989-ish. Well, it wasn't. It was 1989. Because that was the Loma Prieta earthquake, which, you know, was a big deal if you were my age, but it was a big thing because that was the one where the piece of the gold, the Bay Bridge, you know, went smish, made a sandwich out of a lot of people, unfortunately, who were under it. So that was my little corporate training cycle, and so the HR director calls me. I could train, but I couldn't mention God. Absolutely not. Nothing at all that had the slightest hint of spirituality. I could say energy. Energy was okay because that's science, okay? But I couldn't say anything about God. No prayer, no greater reality. Whoa. No karma, no nothing. Just whatever. So she calls me and she says, you know, somebody's wife was on the bridge. So some man lost his wife in their company. Whole company is totally freaked out. She wants me to come and give a talk. She wants me to make them feel better because she thought that I could. And I could. But I thought about it for a minute. I said, I can't do it. I have to tell them about a greater reality. I have to tell them that there is a force that we are all acting on behalf of. We're not here by ourselves. She said, can't you just tell them to believe in themselves? I said, could any of them have kept that woman from dying? Of course not. You can make a union, but if you don't make that community, whether it's the church you go to, the quilting bee that you go to, the community that you physically live in, as I have for most of my adult life, it has to be based on a reality greater than just what I would prefer. A great deal of what we think of as right is just what I prefer. I prefer that the world cooperate with my values. And what we're seeing is this incredible polarization of these people screaming their values and these people screaming their values. And, you know, my cultural circle is supposed to be liberal politically. I just don't participate in most of it. But I've seen pretty much as much selfish vulgarity on both sides of it. You know, people think that I'll just be vulgar and selfish in attacking them. But the vulgarity, the selfishness, the greed, the my way is right, that I prefer it And your way of being frightens me, so you have to change. It's fear. It's all fear. And the only way to ease that fear is to connect yourself to a greater reality. And when you make a community in which everyone is dedicated to a greater reality, then you have something, then you really have something. Then you're really listening to the right note. You know, that is the note that'll really solve it. But you can't fake it. You can't fake it. You can't just get everybody together with nice words. You know, and it all comes back. I've lived in these communities for, as I said, I was 24. I was 22 when I met Swami. I had just turned 23. I was 23 and I was almost 24 when I moved in, and I'm considerably older than that now. So I've been doing it for a long time. And what was so, let me just try to find where I want to say this. All my life, I've been a functional person. I kind of could function in the world. I might have been successful if I'd ever tried to be in another field. But I always felt like I was standing with my back against the wall, just kind of looking at what was going on around me. And I could relate to it, but I could never figure out why I would want to. I couldn't quite figure out what everyone was doing. And as a consequence, you build a shield. Because a whole lot of those universal thoughts are not the ones you want. And so you're there, and I didn't even know I had it. When I moved in 1971 to Ananda Village, I moved to the seclusion retreat at Ananda Village, which is 6 miles back on this very rough dirt road. We didn't have electricity. I mean, internet hadn't been invented. You know, we were just absolutely nowhere. No indoor plumbing, no electricity. It was heaven on earth, actually. We were just out there with nothing, surrounded by kindred spirits. I had never had one. And now I had a whole community. And as soon as you're surrounded by kindred spirits, all of a sudden, this whole possibility of taking down this wall begins to happen to you. You know, and when you start taking down that wall and really start realizing, not just in a very vague theoretical way that I am part of something greater than myself, but you're actually looking into the eyes of people who just like you are listening for that note. Now just think what that means. And also, when your connection with each other is not just, you know, I support you and you support me, like this, but all of you are trying to ride the higher wave. I mean, that's what it takes. Because when it comes down to it, what I prefer is a pretty strong impulse. Because a lot of times, what I prefer is to survive is how it feels. You know, usually we're not as threatened as we think we are. But we think we are. So what difference does it make? I call it the panic survival response, you know, which just comes because you disagree with me. And so because I'm a debater, I'll try to persuade you that I'm right. But whatever it is, but what community allows you to do, whether it's your Sunday community or as I live where all my neighbors are my friends, all of a sudden we can open ourselves on a level that relaxes us on dimensions we didn't know were tense. And it also opens us to the possibility of being fed by our relationships. And I don't just mean, you know, it was a very interesting phenomenon, especially in the early years of Ananda Village. Everybody assumed whenever they saw a man and woman together that they must be married to each other. And people, even who'd been in the community for a while, couldn't quite figure out where the marriage couples were. Because the friendships were so deep among so many people that looking at it, there was only one model that people had in their minds. And I mean, these were very pure and innocent friendships. It wasn't like we weren't promiscuous on any level. That's not what I meant. But the open heart. I mean, just, loneliness is the story. Loneliness is the story for everyone. Longing for connection, longing to be friends, but not just superficially. But people that, as Swami says in his book, The Path, The New Path, he just says that people who really understand. But that has to start with you. I mean, a woman friend who happens to be sitting in this room, but I won't name her, but she came to our church for a while, and she was a sales rep, and she was good. She knew how to work the room. She really worked the room great. I love her. She still knows how to work the room. She does it super. So she came to Ananda, and she started working the room. She said she was Teflon. It was just so annoying. She just couldn't get anybody to see her. And she's charming and beautiful, but nobody would see her. Finally, she just stopped working the room. She started working the altar. She saw the masters on the altar. She started making this connection. Almost immediately, everybody was drawn to her. Now, that's where you start. You start saying, I am part of a greater reality, and I'll choose the first avenue that I have. And if I dedicate myself to that with everything I've got, and don't kid yourself, you can't do it alone. Really, I mean, I'd like to say, oh yeah, you can do it anywhere, you can do anything, you can just go on the internet. No, you can't. Somebody has to be singing that note. And thank you, God, this area is just full of people who are singing lots of notes. You need to go to a lot of choirs and see who's got your music. And as soon as you hear your music, you need to stand in that choir and listen to it over and over and over until you can go into your kitchen and not lose the melody. And then you think, well, why would I sing by myself when I can sing with all these beautiful brothers and sisters? Look at the harmony. We need each other on a level that, well, these are interesting times. We need each other for ourselves. We need each other because we have to give. We need each other because if those people of like mind who understand that we are part of a greater reality, if we don't band together and realize that God is in charge. Thank you. Oh my Lord, what if those politicians were in charge? Boy, that is a bad news, isn't it? On all sides of the spectrum. It's not about power in the world. It's about the power of the Spirit inside of you. And community is the answer to it because we're just too small a minority. And even the most beautiful songs, and there's lots of great songs being sung around here, but even those are ashes in the end. Just one fire coming up the hill, one volcano going down like that, God forbid, one hydrogen bomb. And at the very least, one death, because that's where we're all going to end up. And we will have one thing at that point, we will have our consciousness. And if you have your right consciousness, you have everything. It's like, why are we working on anything else? Then you can use it. You can use it to change the planet. You can use it to create great art. You can use it to raise the most wonderful family. You can use it to grow poppies. It really doesn't matter what you do with it. But if you have the consciousness, you have everything. And if we have each other, then the consciousness becomes so much easier. It's a plea. It's a plea to join hearts and hands upward first to the Spirit. And then in that attunement with the higher reality, everything else will follow. So God bless you.